They lurk within the shadows, stalking their next victims, fueled by sadistic compulsion to kill. They hold no regard for human life, and their insatiable urge to murder never wanes. They are serial killers who have terrorized mankind for ages, and their numbers continue to grow. Statistically, they are responsible for 3,500 to 5,000 murders per year. However, despite the gruesome nature of a serial killer's activities, there has long been a thriving morbid fascination with this breed of killer by societies. Why do they kill, and what drives them? The unanswered questions of a serial killer's criminal motives and psychology will be explored, and the answers may shock you. Nothing can be more terrifying than knowing the streets are being prowled by a twisted serial killer. To be a female of certain age and profession on the streets of 19th century London with the knowledge that one of your clients could be Jack the Ripper himself. There are many more Jack the Rippers in the world. Every human has a capacity for good or evil. We are all dark and light. This has been known for thousands of years. It has been written, preached, symbolized across the world. Just as there are those in history who stood out for their compassion and good works, there are also those who have become infamous for their propensity to evil. From serial killers who murder one human after another, to dictators who order mass genocide upon their own citizens, evil knows no bounds. The first question, of course, is what defines a serial killer? Typically, it is a person who murders 3 or more people in order to satisfy some twisted psychological desire. These murders can be over the course of a few months or years. Most authorities simply state that the motive for a serial killer is psychological gratification, and most appear to involve some form of sexual contact. However, the FBI, who have done extensive research in the field, state that there are multiple reasons, including anger, thrill-seeking, financial gain, and even attention-seeking. All of these reasons have causes, as we shall discover. Quite often, the murders all take similar forms, and the victims themselves may share common traits such as race, sex, or social demographics. Unfortunately, our perceptions about serial killers is the result of Hollywood productions, which only lends more confusion to the true dynamics of serial murder. In fact, the police are often under the same illusion, and so special units are set up to try and get to the reality of the thing. Professionals involved in serial murder cases, such as investigators, prosecutors, and pathologists, often have limited exposure to serial murder. Their experience may be based upon a single murder series, and the factors in that case are extrapolated to other serial murders. As a result, certain stereotypes and misconceptions take root regarding the nature of serial murder and the characteristics of serial killers. TV speculations, or what professionals call talking heads, spout off theories which are often unsubstantiated, but still influence society. A lot of serial killers found it difficult to hold down steady jobs, and some actually worked in the mental health services. In the world of books and movies, serial killers are often depicted as being highly intelligent, yet the facts reveal they generally have a very average IQ. As with all things, there are variations. Criminologist Jose Sanchez reported that the young criminal you see today is more detached from his victim, more ready to hurt or kill. The lack of empathy for their victims among young criminals is just one symptom of a problem that afflicts the whole society. Lorenzo Carcaterra, author of Gangster, explained how potential criminals are labeled by society, which can then lead to their offspring also developing in the same way through the cycle of violence. In the past 100 years in America alone, there have been at least 3,000 serial killers identified. Between them, they have killed at least 10,000 people. 32% murdered for thrill, lust, or power. 30% to gain financial reward. 18% did so in anger. Over 6% murdered to grow their criminal empire, and less than 1% because a religious cult told them to. As we can clearly see in these figures, there is no one reason for all serial killings, no one cause, no one psychological truth behind it all. There is also no one method of murder. 40% use guns, 6% use poison, and 2% used an axe. No one demographical group is predisposed to become serial killers. 52% are white, 40% black, and nearly 7% Hispanic. Men, however, are much more likely to kill than women by a ratio of 10 to 1. There can be many reasons for this 10 to 1 ratio, such as peer pressure, but it is a startling figure. No one knows how many serial killers there are walking our streets. In fact, there are nearly 250,000 unsolved murders in the United States alone, unaccounted for since the 1980s. Every major city in the world has multiple serial killers who have remained uncaught and who strike at any moment. And everyday social and family abuses are creating more and more. It is a world of humanity gone mad, and it affects us. Modern society, for the most part, has lost all sense of community. Vast sprawling cities of concrete are full of humans racing along, competing, destroying, polluting, loving and hating, and all of them ignore each other. There are more divorces, more mother-child separations, more abuse, more drugs, more violence. We are breeding hate, not tolerance. Our media is full of violence, from war movies and horror films to sick and twisted images strewn across the internet. The influence upon the mind of susceptible abused minds is immense and getting worse. Our time, efforts, minds, and even bodies are ravaged by other humans trying to stay one step ahead of the human race. As we go, we use up the resources of the world and throw stinking pollution and plastic back at our own Mother Earth. In this enforced separation from our Mother Earth, we begin to feel alone. This loneliness leads to all manner of psychological problems, not least of which is guilt for doing what we do, and yet we carry on doing it. The modern world we have created through our own stupidity is a fertile breeding ground for creating serial killers. As if it, like viruses, were a natural answer to tip the balance of the human population back towards something more sustainable. This world is now impersonal, and yet not so long ago, we lived in small, tight-knit communities. We traveled rarely, if at all, and would have come in contact with less than 100 people in our entire lives. Today, we live in a world of 7 billion humans who try to avoid each other because we are all on overload. This new life humanity has created gives us consistent impersonal interactions and anonymity. Ideal ground for serial killers. Many serial killers are motivated by fame, or at the very least, attention. In our world, we have mass and social media within which we can find fame and also remain anonymous. Their pool of victims grow by the day. Homeless people, hitchhikers, prostitutes, illegal immigrants, and more are prime pickings for the killer. One of them managed to evade detection for a long time by simply preying on prostitutes, drug addicts, and homeless women. These are what society deems to be the lowest forms of our wonderful society, and so are ignored by the rest until we need them. No mention of the fact that all life is worthy of respect and all need love. Our serial killer told the New York Times reporter Jillian Lauren, "I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists. Nothing like that. If I killed you, it'll be all over the news the next day. I stayed in the ghettos." Motives of serial killers are not always what they seem, and they are certainly not the same as those of a drive-by shooting or angry domestic outburst. They are much more complex. For instance, they are not all socially reclusive, nor do they appear strange. They are not monsters, and often tend to have families, jobs, and normal members of the community. This is often why they are so hard to catch, especially if law enforcement officials are looking for a strange recluse. It is often stated that serial killers travel vast distances to commit and hide their crimes. This is not true. In fact, most serial killers carry out their crimes in a defined geographical area. These are known as comfort zones, and very often have what is called an anchor point, such as a place of work or a home. Sometimes they will expand beyond these boundaries as their competence grows. The exceptions to this are people who travel, such as businessmen or homeless people. Their world is travel, and this is their comfort zone. In short, serial killers are not highly intelligent evil monsters from some Sherlock Holmes novel. The rate at which murders are solved have not in fact increased. They have gotten worse. In 1967, 91% of murders were solved. In 2017, that figure fell drastically to 62%. The ratio of police to population has fallen. The sophistication of technology used by crime fighters has improved, but so too have those of the serial killer. In addition, the modern era has increased the ease of transport. Serial killers can now disappear instantly and appear again somewhere else. At a symposium on serial homicide in 2005, the FBI and other experts in criminology and forensic psychology had an in-depth discussion about the motivations of serial killers. The attendees made a number of observations and recommendations for serial homicide investigations that are related to the motivations of the killer. The motive can be very difficult to determine in a serial murder investigation. A serial murderer can have multiple motives for committing his or her crimes. A serial killer's motives can evolve both within a single murder and throughout the series of murders. The classification of motivations should be limited to observable behavior and conditions at the scenes of the murders. Even if a motive can be identified, it may not be helpful in identifying a serial murderer. Utilizing investigative resources to discern the motive instead of identifying the offender can derail or bog down an investigation. Investigators should not necessarily equate a serial murderer's motivations with the level of injury. Regardless of the specific motives, most serial committers commit their crimes because they want to. The exception to this would be those few serial killers suffering from a severe mental illness for whom no coherent motive exists. The attendees came up with a kind of classification of serial killers. The motives were the driving force for this. These were anger and hostility, criminal enterprise, financial gain, ideology, such as occult power and thrill, sexually based motivation, and the more rare psychosis, whereby the offender is suffering from severe mental illness. In the end, whatever the motive is, serial killers do it because they want to. The murder itself also usually follows a pattern. Serial killers will often use the same method to kill each of their victims. The three most common are shooting, stabbing, and strangulation. After each murder, they use a similar method to dispose of the bodies. Unlike spree killers, serial killers tend to have a cooling-off period between kills. The people they kill become just objects in their mind. And because of this, they are more likely to engage in fetishisms and necrophilia. Because they often struggle to associate with other humans, they see them as possessions. Killing them makes the victim theirs. Many serial killers take souvenirs to help them remember their crimes. They do this to enable them to relive their murders in their heads over and over again. They derive great satisfaction from killing. So it makes sense that they would want to create those feelings as normal people would do with holiday photos, for example. Serial killers have a difficult time dealing with uncertainty, and they lack the proper coping mechanisms to deal with life's ups and downs. But when they kill, they feel in complete control of the situation. Often the early murders are not well carried out, and because they get away with what they have done, their confidence builds. They feel even more empowered, as if this justifies their acts. It makes them feel good in their fantasy world, but because of this newfound confidence, they begin to be bolder and take shortcuts. This leads to mistakes, and they are often caught because of some clumsy error. Of course, once they are caught, we, like law enforcement officers, ask why. What made this person kill? Is there an inbuilt genetic lock inside awaiting the turning of a key? Or are these people the result of their life experiences? They are seemingly ordinary citizens on the surface, with deep psychological errors inside, caused by something in their upbringing and environment. They don't always plan every murder. Something makes them start, and then they learn as they move forward to a point where planning does take a role. They have to learn to select a target and how to approach them. Then they have to control the victim and find ways of disposing the body after the evil deed is done. All of this can seem complex, but it is developed over time. Serial killers, it seems, may exhibit varying degrees of mental illness, which may contribute to their homicidal behavior. Someone who is mentally ill, you see, may have psychotic breaks that cause them to believe they are another person or are compelled to murder by other entities. These are the methods used by our brain's psyche to trick us into doing things physically that we would not normally do. Dark, hidden desires that we repress, but which must somehow surface. Some of the common behavior patterns include sensation seeking, a distant lack of remorse or guilt, the need to be impulsive and to have control, and predatory behavior. They often appear charismatic and charming. This is known as the mask of sanity, a facet to evade detection from others, but also from their own conscious self. More often than not, serial killers have been abused sexually, physically, and mentally by family members. They are also more likely to engage in fetishism, necrophilia, sadism, and pyromania. As children, many of them took their own murderous and sexual intentions upon family pets, and over 60% wet their beds as children. Many were also bullied at school and became loners. In fact, a great many serial killers have faced problems in their childhood. A thing called the Hickey's Trauma Control Model explains how early childhood trauma can cause deviant behavior in adulthood. The child's upbringing and influences becomes a dominant factor, determining whether or not the child's behavior escalates into homicidal activity. Lack of family can be even worse, because it is via the family that the child learns to identify him or herself. The serial killer is no different from any other individual who is instigated to seek approval from parents, sexual partners, or others. This need for approval is what influences children to attempt to develop social relationships with their family and peers. The quality of their attachments to parents and other members of the family is critical to how these children relate to and value other members of society. In 1990, a study on incarcerated serial killers concluded that the most influential factor contributing to their homicidal activity was upbringing. Almost all the serial killers in the study had experienced some sort of environmental problems during their childhood, such as a broken home caused by divorce, or a lack of parental figure to discipline the child. Nearly half of the serial killers had experienced some type of physical or sexual abuse, and more of them had experienced emotional neglect. Neglect leads to low self-esteem, and a fantasy world develops in which they are in control. This leads to the inability to attach, which can further lead to homicidal behavior. Some have claimed that there may in fact be a genetic reason for the existence of serial killers. Two particular serial killers, Bobby Joe Long and Richard Speck, have been used as evidence. Long had an extra X chromosome, while Speck was erroneously reported to have an extra Y chromosome. In fact, when further studies were conducted, there was no issue at all. All research done thus far has revealed no genetic reason for any kind of criminal behavior, and therefore it must be the result of upbringing and environment. Because children create fantasies to hide away, they are in fact creating a new reality for themselves. They have complete control over this new reality. They become their own guide on the journey, and often their inner hatred towards a particular abuser comes out in hatred for all those with similarities in race, age, and sex. Indeed, their hatred may be a jealousy of a sibling who they perceived as not getting the same abuse they have. This jealousy is even expanded to others around them in the community, and jealousy leads to all kinds of things in a fantasy world. The child becomes sociopathic because the normal development of the concepts of right and wrong and empathy towards others is retarded. The child's emotional and social development occurs within his or her own fantasies. A person can do no wrong in his own world, and the pain of others is of no consequence when the purpose of the fantasy world is to satisfy the needs of themselves. The line between fantasy and reality are lost, and fantasies turn to dominance, control, sexual conquest, and violence, eventually leading to murder. The FBI Serial Killing Division states, the answer lies in the development of the individual from birth to adulthood. Specifically, the behavior a person displays is influenced by life experiences as well as certain biological factors. Serial murderers, like all human beings, are the product of their heredity, their upbringing, and the choices they make throughout development. Causality can be defined as a complex process based on biological, social, and environmental factors. In addition to these factors, individuals have the ability to choose to engage in certain behaviors. The collective outcome of all of these influences separates individual behavior from generic human behavior. Since it is not possible to identify all of the factors that influence normal human behavior, it similarly is not possible to identify all of the factors that influence an individual to become a serial murderer. Human beings are in a constant state of development, from the moment of conception until death. Behavior is affected by stimulation received and processed by the central nervous system. Neurobiologists believe that our nervous systems are environmentally sensitive, therefore allowing individual nervous systems to be shaped throughout a lifetime. The development of social coping mechanisms begins early in life and continues to progress as children learn to interact, negotiate, and compromise with their peers. In some individuals, the failure to develop adequate coping mechanisms results in violent behavior. So abuse, neglect, and social pressure all contribute to the development of a potential serial killer. Add into this drug abuse, and here is an increased chance of violence. A study of serial killers by the FBI revealed that 70% of them experience problems related to substance abuse. Now, to be clear, there are very few serial killers who are full-blown addicts, but most of them have had problems connected to substance abuse. The problems usually start in their childhood and include poverty and abuse. Children in situations like this learn that the way to solve problems is by using substances or violence. This destructive way of thinking often follows them into adulthood. Indeed, there are cases where people have had severe head trauma and then gone on to commit murder. Peace, love, and compassion, it seems, walks a fine line between hate and aggression. The accumulated minds of psychologists and law enforcement professionals at a recent FBI symposium agreed on one thing: that there can be no single cause or factor that leads to the development of a serial killer. Instead, there are a multitude of factors that contribute to their development. The most significant factor is the serial killer's personal decision in choosing to pursue their crimes. They stated that there was a predisposition to serial killing, much like other violent offenses. These dispositions were biological, social, and psychological. Not one of these, but a mixture of these. The development towards being a serial killer involved a combination of these factors, where they all coincide at a critical time. A biological predisposition added to a social or environmental experience, leading to a psychological makeup that comes to life at a critical juncture. There is, they state, no genetic template for a serial killer. The factors are too complex. Neither is there a specific demographic. Age, sex, race, and religion may have some psychological element, but not a cause in and of itself. they did find that sexually motivated serial killers found violence erotic. It was a form of sexual gratification, and the root of this can often be found in childhood abuse. The so-called warrior gene is found in 30% of the population, and this can predispose aggressive tendencies. Men are also slightly more violent genetically. The fact remains, though, that a great many serial killers experience childhood trauma or even early separation from their mothers. A lack of this nurturing element has a great effect upon a child. Children learn to suppress their own empathy as a self-protection device. Children through abuse can also have physical trauma that affects the areas of the brain that control emotional and empathetic feelings. Although we have seen, serial killers are not always loners. A great many are. They evade relationships to protect themselves from the learned damage. This grows and grows until it turns into hatred and seeks to control. This grows further until it seeks to destroy other people to eliminate the possibility of rejection, abuse, and humiliation. Many serial killings seem to be completely devoid of meaning or motivation on the part of the criminal. In actuality, however, there is a great diversity in the needs and desires of serial killers that lead them to extinguish the lives of others. Sometimes the act or process of murder can be an end in itself for them. One aspect of popularly held beliefs and media stereotypes that often holds true is that most serial killers derive great satisfaction from the act of killing. The gratification they received from the act of murder differentiates them from one-time murderers who kill incidentally. Serial killers have a chronic and overwhelmingly need to commit murder that distinguishes them from those who kill one time because it serves other criminal interests. It may seem to be counterintuitive on the surface, but many serial killers are actually insecure individuals who are compelled to kill due to a morbid fear of rejection. As we have seen, the fear of rejection results from having been abandoned by their mother in early childhood. Infamous serial killers who were rejected or abandoned by their birth mothers include David Berkowitz, Ted Bundy, and Joel Rifkin. A neophyte serial killer who was traumatized as a child will seek to avoid painful relationships with other human beings as an adult. He will particularly seek to avoid painful relationships with those he desires or covets. So fear of rejection may compel a fledgling serial killer to want to eliminate any objects of his affections. He may come to believe that by destroying the person he desires prior to entering into a relationship with them, he can eliminate the frightening possibility of being abandoned, humiliated, or otherwise hurt by someone he loves as he was in childhood. Almost all serial killers admit that they begin their path of violence and death by hurting animals. For an emerging killer, small animals are good practice because they are trusting and defenseless. They feel pleasure and elation when acting out violently, and they kill animals as a way to perfect their techniques before moving on to human victims. It is one of the first manifestations of an abused child, and it develops quickly unless attended to. If most of us had to kill a chicken for our supper, we'd end up vegetarians. But serial killers are distanced. They lack the empathy because they often did not receive it. Serial killers become desensitized to emotions. because they have most likely not received love. They have protected themselves in this way. And yet they crave love and connection. Their whole persona becomes a bizarre, overblown, bastardized, and fantasy-driven mess, and all because somebody at some early stage in their development didn't treat them well. And because they see others as objects to use or their own self-gratification, they learn quickly how to manipulate people. And we must not forget that it's not only the serial killers who are like this. We are theoretically an evolved and highly advanced species which suppresses the reality of the human condition. We put on blindfolds to the darkness within. A darkness that dwells within us all. A primal aspect of ourselves. One that is eons old and partly responsible for the survival of the human species. And these stories go on and on. So many of them psychologically changed by those very people an innocent child should trust. Loveless households are common with killers. This is why people are suffering, because the modern world of man is unnatural and getting more so by the day. People wear the mask they are pressured to wear. They appear happy and try desperately to keep up with the Joneses, with the car, the kitchen remodel, the fashion, and more. And yet deep inside, something is missing. They feel empty, devoid of emotion, and riddled with copious kinds of fear. Pressure builds and eventually bursts forth as the child they create, the serial killer. Innocent children being parented by sick, fearful, drugged, and unprepared people. The child may grow to appear completely normal, but deep down in the psychological recesses, a trigger is pulled and bang, someone dies. Through anxiety or panic, they attack. Their only way out is to extinguish a life, because their own has somehow been extinguished along the way. Someone who should have loved and guided them did quite the opposite, and darkness will always emerge somewhere in the future. This is not a single mind gone mad. This is not the result of genetic error. This is the result of mind manipulation, just as Adolf Hitler would go on to manipulate the Nazis to mass genocide. In 144 BC, Lu Pingli of China, nephew of the Han Emperor Jing, would go out on marauding expeditions with 20 or 30 slaves or young men who were in hiding from the law, murdering people and seizing their belongings for sheer sport. It was not until the 29th year of his reign that the son of one of these victims finally sent a report to the emperor, and it was soon discovered that he had murdered at least 100 people. The officials of the court requested that Lu Pingli be executed. However, the emperor could not bear to have his own nephew killed, so Lu Pingli was made a commoner and banished. Nobody knows whether he continued in his sport afterwards. These murders were not carried out for sheer sport at all. They were carried out to satisfy something in this prince, something that had been placed there by others, and most likely due to his position in society. In the 15th century, Gilles de Rais, a friend of Joan of Arc, sexually assaulted and murdered peasant children. They were mostly boys he had gathered from villages around his castle. No one knows how many he abused and murdered, but estimates range between 140 and 800 children. And he was not the only privileged member of aristocracy to go on a killing spree, as we shall see. In the early 17th century, Elizabeth Bathory in Transylvania tortured and killed up to 650 girls and women before she was finally arrested. In India, the infamous cult of the Thuggee murdered 1 million people over the course of 100 years. One member of the cult, known as Beharam, was alone responsible for the murder of over 900. Of course, the most well-known serial killer is the man who would take on legendary status in 19th century London, Jack the Ripper. No one knows who he was. There are suspicions that he may have been royalty or even a member of the police force. Some say there were many Rippers at large. We will probably never know, but he was the subject of a massive manhunt and investigation by the Metropolitan Police, during which many modern criminal investigation techniques were pioneered. He was not the first serial killer in history, but his case was the first to create a worldwide media frenzy, and we have been fascinated with serial killers ever since. The dramatic murders focused the media's attention on the plight of the urban poor and gained coverage worldwide. He was so confident in his own protected fantasy world that he even wrote to newspapers. Here is what he is alleged to have written. Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work that last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me and my funny little games. I saved some proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha! The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send it to the police officers just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away, if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. In the USA, H. Holmes was responsible for the death of at least 9 victims in the early 1890s. At the same time in France, Joseph Vacher became known as the French Ripper after killing and mutilating 11 women and children. In the 1940s, a man named Robert Dale Psyche, as well as being a prolific arsonist, also killed at least 168 by setting fire to a circus vent. As a child, his father would punish him by holding his fingers over a candle flame. Some serial killers, such as Edmund Kemper, are tormented and abused and even tortured by their birth mothers. There are exceptions to the typical fantasy patterns of serial killers, as in the case of Dennis Rader, who was a loving family man and leader of his church. But the vast majority seem to come under this fantasy turned into reality role. He was a Boy Scout leader and had served in the U.S. Air Force. He was a local government official and president of his church. He killed at least 10 people in Wichita, Kansas over a 30-year period and taunted the police by sending letters to the news media. Gerald Stano needed to have control of his and other lives, and so he killed at least 22 women. He said it was like stepping on a cockroach and that he got sexual pleasure from strangling them with his bare hands. By doing so, he owned them. They could no longer reject and humiliate him. In the 1970s, Jeffrey Dahmer killed, dismembered, and partially ate 17 boys and men. Why? He stated, "Not because I hated them, but to keep them with me." He had been a lonely child. Jeffrey Dahmer suffered childhood neglect and emotional abuse, compounded by a sexual assault by a neighbor. Dahmer's mother was a germaphobe and avoided touching or holding Dahmer as an infant, and even wouldn't allow other family members to touch him. These components led him to an early obsession with death, torture, and alcoholism. As a teen, Dahmer bleached dead animal bones and even nailed a severed dog's head to a tree. He would often search for fresh roadkill to add to his carcass collection. Later, Dahmer confessed that his compulsions toward necrophilia and dismemberment began at age 14, around the time of a turbulent breakdown of his parents' marriage. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered, dismembered, and cannibalized 17 young men. In 1994, Dahmer met his reckoning. He was murdered by a repulsed prison inmate. As a child, John Wayne Gacy's homosexual tendencies spurred physical and abusive tirades by his strict father, who would routinely beat Gacy and his mother. Gacy also endured several sexual assaults at a young age by various men, contributing to the mental and emotional trauma to Gacy's psychological growth. As a killer, Gacy would handcuff his young male victims and force them to plead for their lives, in effect, reenacting his own personal experiences as a boy living in mortal fear of his father's wrath. Before his lethal injection in 1994, Gacy defiantly stated, "Why would I kill these boys anyway? I'm not their father." Unabomber Ted Kaczynski terrorized the country between 1978 and 1995, killing 3 people and injuring dozens more with bombs sent through the mail. As an infant, Kaczynski suffered a traumatic illness and was isolated from his parents for weeks. Upon returning home, his parents noticed a sharp decline in the infant's psychological nature, which scholars believe was the beginning of Kaczynski's mental corrosion. Hailed as a young, brilliant mind, he participated in a paid psychological research project at Harvard, where he was subjected to intensive mental trauma to measure his stress endurance. The crippling experience led him to an extremist anti-government and technology sentiments. His compulsion to kill soon followed, along with a 35,000-word manifesto which Kaczynski believed justified his actions. Ted Kaczynski was imprisoned for 13 felony bombing-related attacks. Ramirez, one of 5 children all born with birth defects, due to their mother being exposed to chemical fumes working at a boot factory while pregnant. His father was violent toward the children and beat them as a means of discipline. When his cousin returned from the Vietnam War, he became a role model for Ramirez, exposing the child to Polaroids of women his cousin raped and mutilated. What should have been repulsive to the child, Ramirez was sexually aroused. As a young man, Ramirez became a cocaine addict and delved into Satanism, leading him into a seductive world of sadism and murder. In the end, Ramirez admitted that he should never be released and be put to death. Gary Ridgway was a truck painter, church attendee, and married. He picked up prostitutes and killed 48 women over a 20-year period. In the 1990s, Robert Yates killed 17 prostitutes in the Spokane, Washington area. He was married, had 5 children, and was a decorated U.S. National Guard helicopter pilot. He was eventually arrested and pleaded guilty to 13 murders. All of these men lived in their own protected, self-created fantasy world. Of course, there are people who are technically serial killers, such as Paul Reed, who murdered at least 7 people during a series of fast food chain robberies. These are almost spree killings, not serial killings. The motivation here was not because of some fantasy world creation, but to kill witnesses to his crime. Amazingly, Vlado Tenesky, a crime reporter, was a respected journalist who was only caught after a series of articles he wrote gave away clues that he had murdered people. Russell Williams was a successful and respected career Royal Canadian Air Force colonel who was convicted of murdering 2 women, along with fetish burglaries and rapes. As the old saying goes, you never can tell, or can you? In Toronto, there's an area known as the Gay Village, where many immigrants from Southern Asia and the Middle East went to because of the fear their own families would abuse them for being homosexual. Serial killer Bruce MacArthur chose this very spot for its anonymity and killed 8 men. We are a species that has distanced itself from its true nature. We have a consistent history of conquest via murder, betrayal, and deceit. The world today is blind to this, and the shock and astonishment of quasi-evil acts upon one another seems suddenly out of place. In many cases, these horrific acts that modern humans secretly relish via their television screens reveals a lot about ourselves. Our glorious press only reports its astonishment of the acts and is in no position clinically or psychologically to make statements or observations. And yet they utter their disdain when the killer shows no remorse, wholly failing to grasp the complexity that created the monster. They show us images of the madmen and women, but don't tell us what it was that created them: society. Though we can better understand the foundation of a serial killer's penchant for murder, there is the undeniable truth that a child's neglect, abuse, and psychological trauma will always be a component of human existence. At this very moment, future serial killers are being fostered, and there is very little, if anything, we can do to prevent the next Ted Bundy from emerging. This unholy breed of killer will always be among us.